Ancient Egypt has been a source of fascination for much of the world for a while, even before the 19th century explosion in European interest. In fact, ever since the takeover of Egypt by the Rashidun Caliphate in the mid-7th century, the mysteries of the ancient civilization have been studied with some success. With its prominent role in the story of Moses, a significant figure in 3 of the world's major religions, Egypt has long held the promise of profound secrets, waiting to be translated and brought to light. Mystery is fertilizer for misconception, and the field in which misconception grows is pop culture. For over a century, novels, films, and latterly video games have used ancient Egypt as a setting. Elements of those media, walking mummies, cursed tombs, and the undying legend of the slaves that built the pyramids, have made it so far into the popular consciousness that everyone, myself included, has to work to unravel the misconceptions from the truth. So settle in, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, pour yourselves a cup of something comforting, and roll titles. After I enjoyed making my Steeler video about 9 factlets, I realised I wanted to do something in a similar format but more substantial. Just to preface the list, there are some things in a video like this you might be expecting to see, namely almost anything to do with ancient Egyptian religion, but while researching and writing this, I came up with so many of those that I've actually put them aside for a future video of their own. Why 9? Okay, well, 9 is a number of significance to the ancient Egyptians. Because the ancient Egyptian language, like many languages around the world, had a singular and a dual number for things that were pairs, and a plural for every other number of things, the number 3 became a synecdoche for the concept of plurals. 3 threes, 9, is therefore a multitude of things. 9 has become synonymous with many, the same way that Chinese languages, for example, have used the number 10,000 to mean anything from a great many to functionally infinite. There are a couple of groups of 9 in particular that show this. In Heliopolis, and indeed other parts of Egypt, 9 particularly important gods were sorted into a group known to us by the Greek term Ennead, but to the Egyptians as a Persejet or possibly Pisichat. There are references to multiple Enneads of greater, lesser, or local importance. A more abstract and prominent use of the number was the phrase the 9 bows. The 9 bows, which is how we translate this phrase in the modern day, are an abstract representation of all foreign nations. Here the 9 definitely stands in for a generic multitude, as opposed to with the Persejet where it's a specific list of 9 things, the overall concept here being that there are many foreign nations. I'll talk more about the significance of the bows later in this very video. With all that said, on to the list. Number 1. These are the pyramids.
No.
These, of course, are the famous pyramids of Giza, but they aren't the pyramids. These are neither the first, nor the last, nor even a significant proportion of the pyramids ever built, though this one is the largest as far as we know. I doubt very much that the supposed inventor of the pyramid, the architect Imhotep, conceived of the idea. Inventors don't usually originate the ideas they bring to life, after all. But once he mastered the design and building techniques, the pyramid became the go-to monument of choice, for a time at least. There are around 120 pyramids, more or less confirmed to have reached some stage of construction, but satellite evidence indicates there may be more under the sand. A big breakthrough occurred in 2011 when archaeologists from the University of Alabama, with the use of NASA satellites and infrared scanning, discovered the remains of 17 pyramids, as well as thousands of settlements and tombs. So there's a lot still under the sand, and as our scanning gets more refined, we'll likely find more ancient secrets. What all this evidence shows us is that the remarkable thing about the Great Pyramid is that despite being so tall, it's still standing. The same can't be said for the vast majority of the 120 plus pyramids ever built in Egypt. Some, such as the pyramid at Meidum, were not planned properly and collapsed during construction. Meidum is pretty much the iconic example of being built on shifting sands. Its inner structure still stands because it was built on bedrock, but the outer layers weren't. Ahmose I's cenotaph pyramid wasn't a solid stone structure at all. It was a limestone shell filled with sand and rubble. When the casing was removed for other construction projects, the cenotaph fell. I'm not completely certain, but I bet that was a bit of a surprise to someone at the time. The bent pyramid at Dahshur has had a number of stories explaining its distinctive shape. It was once thought that the sudden change to a less steep angle was to do with the failing health of the pharaoh and the need to finish the project quickly. It's more likely that the builders realised that the steep angle wouldn't be stable enough after completion given the fate of Meidum. Whatever the motivation for the variance, whether it was by design all along or for the sake of stability, it's still standing, so...
Hooray! Way to go.
Speaking of pyramids, number 2. The pyramids were built by slaves.
It's an urban legend that never happened.
Ancient Egypt made use of slaves, but it's really important to understand that there are lots of kinds of slaves beyond the chattel kind associated with, for example, the antebellum United States, wherein human beings are treated as private property. It's also a term laden with modern meanings and associations, including the nearly but sadly not quite universal revulsion for the concept. Is a serf a slave, tied to the land and labouring for an overlord in return for the right to a roof over their heads? Are modern 9-to-5 workers slaves, dependent upon giving 35 plus hours of their lives each week to labour on someone else's behalf for the right to food and shelter? Most people wouldn't say so, but plenty would, and it goes to show that the term is as ambiguous as it is loaded. In ancient Egypt, the varieties of servitude evolved over time, but let's focus on the Old Kingdom and the construction of tombs. It looks like there might well have been some slave labour involved, but the archaeological evidence makes it very clear that the work sites were occupied by a bulk of paid workers. They were obliged to work on the monuments by a system known as corvée, wherein all or part of a person's duties to the state, our equivalent would be income tax, is comprised of labour. But in the case of the pyramid builders at least, this labour wasn't unpaid. The idea of mass slave labour constructing the pyramids seems to start with Greek settlers, who struggled to imagine many centuries after the fact construction projects on that scale without forced labour. Herodotus wrote of 100,000 bonded slaves, when in fact it was between 10 and 30,000, and they were paid for their work. Now, I think it's important to say that just because someone isn't chattel ordered to work on the point of a spear doesn't mean they're not forced. The Egyptian people didn't arise of their own free will to erect improbably gigantic monuments to their kings. It was a duty they had to perform, with penalties when they failed to report for it, and it certainly would have been back-breaking, sometimes lethal work. The unmummified skeletons of the workers show clear signs of permanent damage to their spines, so even had they survived working on the pyramids, their mobility would have been impaired forever afterwards. For this dangerous and injurious labour, the workers at the Great Pyramid were honoured with burial close to the site. This would have been an enormous privilege, since the Giza Plateau was holy ground. It isn't a place where chattel slaves are disposed of. So I think what we should say is that yes, the pyramids were built with forced labour, but the same system, corvée, also farmed Egyptians' fields and was generally the backbone, of Egypt's economy. And honestly, unless you live in a country with universal basic income where you would have a home to live in and food to eat in return for neither money nor labour, well, what I'm saying is people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And there was this guy called Karl Marx, and number 3, Egyptian tombs were all cursed or trapped.
You could not be more wrong. You could try, but you would not be successful.
Anyone who ventures into underground spaces, either for a living or as a hobby, would vouch that there's an element of danger in doing so. Of course, in natural environments like caves, the unpredictability and instability of the surroundings can get people into trouble and has led to tragedy on many occasions. Yet, even venturing into a human-built structure is dangerous. The tombs of the pharaohs are not replete with spring-loaded pressure plates and giant boulders, but it's fair to say they weren't designed for ingress by living people. If you don't know the layout of a mastaba or pyramid, then you might find yourself falling afoul of the sudden drop into a burial chamber, a couple of meters straight onto a stone floor. But if you're exploring a newly opened tomb, you might have doomed yourself simply by walking in. I'm not talking about a magical curse, well, not yet anyway, but the fact that as you descend, you may be walking into a lake of carbon dioxide. Unlike caves, which are often, though crucially not always, naturally ventilated, tombs are sealed. The internal atmosphere is cut off completely from the rest of the world. Carbon dioxide, one of the denser gases in the air, if not kept circulated, will settle downwards over time. This phenomenon has killed people even out in the open when the terrain and air pressure have allowed pockets of the gas to roll over settlements, so it's a very real threat. Bearing in mind that as you explore the tomb you're putting more into the air around you and rebreathing it in an enclosed environment, and you could be in trouble. The lightheadedness that it can cause can disorient you and rob you of your sense of direction, making returning to fresher air more difficult. And that's about as much as I think I want to say before I feel the need to put in a content warning for claustrophobia, but you get the picture. Breaking open a tomb that's been sealed for centuries or longer, you're going to want to give it some time to let the two atmospheres blend, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to set up an air conditioning and circulation system. As for curses, most of the magical spells involved in Egyptian tombs are directed at evil spirits that trouble the deceased in the afterlife. There are spells directed at the enemies of the deceased or at any intruders into the tomb, but these are exceedingly rare. In fact, after the end of the Old Kingdom in the 2180s BCE, anti-intruder curses became much less common. They often threatened misfortune or undiagnosable illness, and some went as far as evoking the wrath of the gods directly. The reason that these curses aren't more common is in part due to a pervasive belief of the Egyptians that to depict something in drawing, sculpture, or writing was to evoke it. To mention tomb robbers was to invite them, so you had to be careful how you depicted or alluded to such desecrations. Better, perhaps, simply to seal the tomb and not tempt fate. The popularity of the idea of tomb curses is pretty easy to trace. For a long time, hieroglyphs were mysterious, and they remain mysterious to the majority of people even now. Some of the earliest texts translated were books of spells, and combined with some of the misfortunes suffered by several archaeological teams, you can see how a narrative builds. This isn't just the usual othering of foreign cultures, though there is an element of that. The Egyptians would absolutely have agreed that the hieroglyphs had magical weight. They wore protective jewellery with potent symbols like the ankh and the wedged eye, precisely because to depict a thing was to evoke the thing, to manifest its power in the world. It's just that actually, this belief made it less likely for a tomb to rain curses down on the heads of intruders, not more. Tutankhamun's tomb in particular has been associated with an embarrassment of accidents and illnesses, seemingly directed at various people who visited or were involved with the tomb after its legendary opening. For my money, I'd say that even if you were unable to satisfy yourself that the deaths were unrelated to the tomb, you do have to question why, if Egyptian magic was so effective, it was focused on punishing intrusion rather than preventing it. Number 4. The Middle Kingdom ended in an invasion.
This one was invented by a writer.
To the Egyptians of the Ptolemaic period, the idea of Egypt as a powerful nation had taken a bit of a beating. Egypt had endured centuries of subjugation by the Persians, and although Alexander sweeping into the Nile Delta was latterly seen as liberation, particularly since Egypt was left independent under Ptolemy, I'm convinced there was an acute awareness that they were still under foreign rule. To reclaim Egypt as an idea, it was important to look back and retell its histories in a way that made it look righteous and tenacious. Presenting for your delectation and edification, your lordships and majesties, the Hyksos invasion. The Hyksos were a Canaanite people who had been immigrating into Egypt and integrating with the population of Lower Egypt, the Delta region, for more than a century leading up to the end of the Middle Kingdom. This was pretty inevitable considering that it was a period of expansion and domination. The idea of Egypt being two kingdoms, and hence one of its names, Hortawi, wasn't just convention. The two lands had different needs, different problems, and different demographics. In time, as happened whenever the power of the pharaoh waned, the fracture lines between Upper and Lower Egypt began to appear, and as it happened, the Hyksos were in a position to take rulership. They didn't sweep west into Egypt with a conquering army. They simply weren't being properly served by the pharaoh, and a power vacuum needed to be filled. The invasion narrative was invented, or at least popularized, by Manetho in his Aegyptiaca. essentially an encyclopedic handbook of Egyptian history and society written to help the Ptolemaic ruling class settle into their role. It painted the Hyksos as not only invaders but tyrants, eventually justly overthrown by Ahmose, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty and the founder of the New Kingdom. In reality, all the Hyksos had ever really done was offend the nationalistic sensibilities of the Egyptians. See, the Hyksos styled themselves as pharaohs, and why not? They'd been Egyptian for a century or more. Like hundreds of societies thereafter, even into the modern day, the Egyptians' tolerance for foreigners ended at about the point those foreigners joined the ruling class. The narrative of the invasion went unquestioned for a very long time, and I don't think it takes great insight to see why the gentleman scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries were perfectly prepared to buy the idea of tricksy foreigners using brute force to overcome the just rule of an imperialist regime before being turned away. And, as I've said before, the irony of British historians in particular looking at it that way should either make your eyes roll out of your head or your blood turn to steam in your veins. The saying goes that history is written by the victors. I think the Hyksos invasion narrative and the story of the heroic founding of the New Kingdom actually demonstrates that the inverse is often the case. Victory is decided by the historians. Number 5. The Egyptians loved beer. Of all the things that people nowadays commonly say was remarkable about ancient Egypt, one of the most baffling to me is how quickly they point out that the Egyptians enjoyed beer. What's remarkable about that? Pretty much every culture with access to a surplus of grain will eventually discover how to ferment it. Fermented foods and drinks are very prevalent. You achieve flavours you just can't get from any other process or ingredient, and if you ferment certain things, you achieve refreshment and intoxication, which is a pretty popular combination, ask birds and monkeys. Today, worldwide, beer is a $500 billion industry. It shouldn't surprise anyone that the ancient Egyptians liked it. So, if I'm saying this is true, why am I listing it as a misconception? Well, that's because when you imagine beer, if you're from much of the world, you're imagining something more like this, when that's not what an ancient Egyptian would recognise as beer. To them, and indeed still in many communities in Africa even now, beer was a cloudy, fermented porridge-like soup, with plenty of solids to deliver protein and micronutrients. It was for nutrition, rather like what we would call gruel, only fermented. It keeps quite well, it's more interesting to taste than bread, and it's got a lot of calories, which is perfect for fueling a day of farm labour. You could certainly get drunk on it, but bear in mind that unlike a pint of Houston's balmy Bishop Bitter, Egyptian beer was filling. You were eating it more than drinking it, so it's harder to knock back a few with the lads before rolling out for top bants and a cheeky Nando's. I mean, come on, it's a lightly fermented, live culture protein shake. It's like something that guy at your gym is always trying to convince you to sell as part of his health food MLM. It's hipster health porridge. I'm amazed it isn't a growth industry sold alongside plaid shirts, horn-rimmed glasses, and moustache wax. It really does sound like I'm calling out a specific guy I know, but I promise I'm not. You're just being paranoid, Paul. Number 6. Hatshepsut and Nefertiti were queens.
You miscalculated.
Another one that might be categorized as slightly misleading. Okay, when people say queen today, they could be applying it to 4 kinds of people. Female monarchs, the wives of monarchs, gay people if you're a baby boomer, and any women on social media doing something they approve of. Let's talk about the first 2. In ancient Egypt, queen was not a title that applied either to female pharaohs or to the wives of pharaohs. The foremost of the pharaoh's wives was called this, which translates as something like great royal wife, and in Middle Egyptian may have been pronounced something close to Khimar Nisiwar Wura. Obviously, when translating, you pick a translation that is semantically as close as possible, but semantics always includes a certain amount of cultural translation as well, so okay, queen is a pretty good translation for great royal wife, which as a phrase doesn't quite work to the ear of most European languages. At this point, I could go off on a long ramble about how it's interesting that in most European languages, the word for queen is just the word for king with a feminine feminine inflection. But in English, we have the word queen, which etymologically originally just meant wife, and then specifically king's wife, and from there, king's wife or female monarch. But that's for a long pointless Twitter thread some other time. Just as Egyptian didn't have a snappy single word we can just simply translate as queen, it also lacked a snappy single word we can straightforwardly translate to king. The closest among the many titles the pharaohs possessed was this term, which we conventionally translate as King of Upper and Lower Egypt, but more literally would be rendered as he of the sedge and bee, because the sedge plant and bee are thought to have been iconic of the two kingdoms, and which in Middle Egyptian has been reconstructed to be pronounced something close to Nisiwarbiatai. For example, the woman we call Hatshepsut was, once she became pharaoh in her own right, Nisiwarbiatai Muakaria, or he of sedge and bee Maatkare. Nefertiti in turn seems to have ruled under the regnal name Ankhkeperere, though under different personal names, one of which was a man's. In both of these instances, the women assumed a male persona as king of Egypt, because that phrase, Nisiwarbiatai, Nesutbiti, is the word that we commonly render as dual king, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. When written out in full, the majority of the time, Hatshepsut's personal name was rendered as the son of Ra, not the daughter of Ra, because in her aspect as the living Horus, she was the father of the nation. This isn't the story of people who are transgender in the way most of us would mean it, but it is a narrative about the flexibility of gender and how, in a society that is inflexible on the fact that men should hold supreme earthly power, when presented with the prospect of either changing that or changing their own names and personas, Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, at least initially, chose the latter. Beyond that, as a cisgendered man, I don't feel qualified to comment, but I consider any canonical instance of gender nonconformity to be a victory in the fight against the gender binary, even if that nonconformity is bizarrely a way of conforming. Now, this isn't all that serious, but I do have a sneaking suspicion that if Hatshepsut could speak English, she'd prefer to be called king than queen. And in English, there's no real reason she couldn't be. There's absolutely nothing wrong with calling someone Her Majesty the King, or calling someone the king and then using she/her pronouns. You see, in English, we don't have grammatical gender the way other European languages do, so there's nothing inherently masculine about the word king, except that we historically, conventionally, apply it to men. But, we also apply the word doctor to both men and women and never bothered having doctoresses. There's nothing wrong with calling Hatshepsut and Nefertiti queens if you really insist. Both were indeed royal wives before ruling in their own right, but to the Egyptians and to the women in question, there was a huge difference between those two stages of their lives. I'm not saying we all need to revise en masse how the English language treats royalty and start referring to King Victoria and her husband Queen Albert, but it would be etymologically I'm not saying we should necessarily it's too late to look. Elizabeth Swan was a pirate king. Women can be anything. Number 7. The Egyptians were all black, or Semitic, or white, or name a race.
I couldn't hear you over the sound of your wrongness.
This is a big misconception that people have, and it's a big argument that people have, and gosh, one day I hope my channel's big enough that a whole bunch of toxic dude bros will have this debate in my comments section. The so-called Egyptian race controversy is something that deserves a proper look, but that proper look isn't one I'm going to give it until much later on, if ever. For one thing, it needs voices other than my own, because all I can do is lend the view of a white non-Egyptian, and more than that, a citizen of a country that once ruled Egypt as an imperial power. So with all that in mind, pardon my brevity here. Putting aside for now the fact that modern conceptions of race and ethnicity are in no way similar to the conceptions held by the ancient world, Egypt is now and has always been a racially diverse place. Being on the threshold between Africa and Asia, it inevitably attracted populations from many neighbouring lands, and of course from its earliest days, it held sway over both the Sinai Peninsula and regions south of the First Cataract. What you tend to find in modern Egypt is that as you move south, the median skin tone darkens, and Both phenotypes and DNA start to have more in common with the populations of Central Africa than North Africa or the Middle East, and genetic studies keep showing that this has more or less always been the case. So the ancient Egyptians weren't exclusively black Africans, and they weren't exclusively Middle Eastern or Mediterranean. They were a blend of a lot of populations, just as their descendants are now. So maybe we shouldn't worry about whether the ancient Egyptians were a particular race, and spend more time wondering why we care. Number 8. The Egyptians were insular and distrustful of foreigners.
It's a total fabrication.
Right at the beginning of the video, I gave a little hint about the Egyptians' attitude to foreign nations. The fact that the abstract idea of the totality of foreign nations was referred to as the 9 bows. Or, well, let's forget the 9 thing. We've established that 9 is a synonym for many, so the many bows. Indicating foreign powers with a homonym for a deadly weapon seems a fairly clear expression of your distrust of those powers, right? I mean, in the modern day, if your government renames its foreign affairs department to the Ministry for War, that's pretty telling. I don't think it's telling in quite the same way. The ancient Egyptians didn't see all foreign powers as enemies, but to the ancient Egyptian mind, anything that you weren't in control of, anything that was unpredictable, was a potential threat. Much of their religion and their moral philosophy was devoted to taking control of things that, by default, weren't in anyone's control. The behaviour of the Nile, for example, the behaviour of wild animals, these were things the Egyptians depended upon the gods to oversee in their favour. Like a bow, a foreign country's nature is to be depended upon when you're in control of it, but watched closely when someone else is. At the point in its history where it was an imperial power, Egypt was an enthusiastic diplomat. It had to be. On the scale of nations, diplomacy is as much a form of self-defense as the mustering of an army. The lesson that Egypt knew all too well from its earliest days, the lesson that was reinforced at many regrettable points throughout its history, was that diplomatic failures had tragic consequences. You had to keep those bows turned away from you, and preferably turned to your use. To call foreign nations the many bows or 9 bows wasn't an expression that they were all inherently threats, but that they all could be. It's caution, not open distrust. Now, just a moment, you might be thinking, didn't I just say that the Egyptians were racist against the Hyksos? Well, yes, no doubt the desire to remove the Hyksos from power was in part motivated by their being of foreign descent. But on the other hand, believe me when I say the Egyptians fought rival dynasties ferociously, whether they were foreign or not. So their being Canaanite isn't a hand that should be overplayed. I think, honestly, it was more important to the later narrative than it was a motivator at the time. As for being insular, literally how could they be? Remember the whole gateway between Africa and Asia thing? Egypt, like many nations with a sense of the divinity of its own existence, wanted to be the centre of the universe. Its religious beliefs, however, made it difficult for it to conquer vast territory, since Egyptians were very hesitant to risk dying away from the Nile Valley and risking their place in the afterlife. As such, Egypt's imperial policy was to hold sway, and holding sway inevitably attracts immigration. I've said before and I'll say again, societies generally benefit from immigration, and the ancient Egyptians knew that as well as anyone. Before the final misconception, let's swing over to the altar of patrons where I thank a patron for their support. Huge thanks to Joe. Go forth with my blessing that you may live, prosper, and thrive. If you'd like to have your name read out in a video essay and get a few more goodies on top, including the ongoing opportunity to vote on video topics and pitch ideas to me, as well as helping me reach my channel goals, you can become one of the earliest members of my Patreon community at patreon.com/armchairegypt. All patrons' names go into the descriptions of every video, and £5 plus patrons are put into the thanking hat for a personal thank you message on my longer videos. And finally, number 9. Ancient Egypt is all one thing.
It's a fake.
This one is easier to explain than to express in a single pithy line, but you know the sort of thing I mean. The ancient Egyptians believed X, the ancient Egyptians did Y. Ancient Egypt was around for thousands of years. Do facts about your region of the world hold true 3,000 years ago? Okay, so one of the things that's remarkable about ancient Egypt is how much did stay the same. The language very broadly, particularly the hieroglyphic writing system. The religion evolved and its nuances changed, but many of the top gods were on top for the whole ride. There were always kings, and at least from very early on, they were always the sons of Ra. Certainly more was similar about ancient Egypt over 3 millennia than was similar about your part of the world 3 millennia ago. But the devil, when not entering misconceived musical pissing matches in the southern United States, is in the details, and those details are pretty important. These things that in the broad strokes were consistent over time, the language, the religion, the social hierarchies, changed in some pretty important ways. Even iconic visual facts, the look, the art style, the architecture evolved. What's happening is, we've been uncovering artifacts, settlements and tombs, and deciphering texts non-chronologically. Egyptology's been a thing for a very long time, but modern Egyptology has had an explosion of success for the last 200 years since the first successful translation of hieroglyphs. That's a lot of discoveries about a very long period of time in a much shorter period of time. And popular culture is like a juicer that filters some things, mixes others, grinds them up, and produces the idea of ancient Egypt in our heads without the full context of the order in which things happened and the amount of time between things happening. If you tell someone about how Cleopatra lived closer to the invention of the iPad than the construction of the Great Pyramid, you shouldn't be surprised if they take a few moments to absorb that fact, because she's seen as part of the homogeneous blob that most people call ancient Egypt, and the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. Now, we all know that the expansion of Britain's railways didn't happen during the reign of William IV, even though these were both periods in the history of England. But that's because we're not uncovering the history of England piecemeal in the same way that we're uncovering the history of ancient Egypt. The string that we tie events in British history to is long and straight, as opposed to the tangle that ancient Egyptian events are currently sorted into. Even so, we still homogenize our eras somewhat. Most people would call the period between 1837 and 1901 the Victorian period, even though society looked very different at either end of that period. And it might seem academic, but the way we smush historic societies into low-resolution blobs isn't a harmless tendency, because we also do it to real-life cultures. Think about all the times you've heard phrases alluding to what the Japanese like to eat and what's considered rude in Germany. I live in the UK, the country of Brexit, a thing that happened that not everyone voted for or approved of. So in centuries to come, when they write that the people of the UK sought to sever themselves from the European Union and decided to do so in 2016, there's a hell of a lot of nuance being deleted by that statement. It's only true with a whole bunch of asterisks. And yeah, you can't harm the ancient Egyptians by stereotyping them, by calling them beer enthusiasts or death cultists or cat worshippers, but the instinct to erase nuance or internal diversity, either when looking at foreign cultures or even your own, isn't always a good one, and it can lead to some highly undesirable consequences. Like Brexit. If there's a central thread that these misconceptions hang on, it's that we all have a habit of filling in the gaps in our knowledge with guesswork, and whenever there are degrees of separation between us and the thing we're studying, whether that separation comes about through physical distance, cultural incompatibility, vast spans of time, or all three, there can be tremendous gaps. The natural impulse is to simplify, and that's a morally neutral act, but it's best to do it conscientiously. Simplifying things is an essential component of making a subject accessible, and that's the main pillar of my entire channel, so you can bet your last Deben of flour that I do it, and depend in turn on others doing it. My hope is that highlighting some of the more common misconceptions in Egyptology, even in the cases where there's a deal of truth behind them, I've inspired you to look into one or two of these on your own, or perhaps to undergo a similar exercise in a subject you're already knowledgeable about. My bet is that you'll find something that surprises you. Thank you for watching my list, I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm moving house soon, which means I can't rely on finding the time to work on these longer videos. That being said, I fully intend to keep up my pace of weekly videos. They'll just continue to be of the shorter variety for a while. If you did enjoy this video, that often neglected like button makes a huge difference to the visibility of my channel, so I humbly ask you to consider just gently tapping upon it. The artists for my videos are Lazy Honeybee and Praxis Descends, and my intro and background music are by Sassy Dragon. You can find all of their various socials on screen and in the description below. The writing, narration and editing, such as it was, is by me, Lucas. My details are here and below, and I'm a freelance writer who's done some ghostwriting for other YouTube channels, so you can get in touch with my business email in the description if you want to make an inquiry. As always, my eternal gratitude goes out to my patrons on patreon.com/armchairegypt whose glorified names are before you. The community is growing healthily, so if you want to get involved in the early stages of the channel, the best time to do that was yesterday, and the second best is today. I also have a new Ko-fi page for one-off donations, which, I'm not going to lie, are very much appreciated as house moving season approaches. Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.